Before we get to our guest's insight on the telecom sector, Caleb Goddard joins us now with a quick overview of telecom stocks in Asia this year. Caleb.
Hey, Kathy. The MSCI Asia Pac Index of nearly 1,000 stocks is broken down into 10 industry groups. And this year you can find telecom stocks sitting near the bottom. The MSCI Asia Telecom Index has lost more than 6% this year. The only groups doing worse are healthcare and utility stocks. The index has been dragged down by service providers in Asia's more developed markets, including Japan, Korea, Hong Kong, and Australia, with NT Docomo doing the worst. Not only is Japan's #1 mobile phone company getting hurt by Japan's recession, SoftBank is also eating into Docomo's market share thanks to SoftBank's exclusive contract to sell Apple's iPhone in Japan. There are some winners, and they come from Asia's emerging markets. Telecom Malaysia leads the way, followed by India's Idea Cellular, China Telecom, which is moving into the mobile business, Singtel, and Globe Telecom of the Philippines. Now, telecom stocks can be viewed as dividend plays. In fact, Telecom Malaysia, Globe Telecom, and Singtel have some of the highest yields in the telecom index. And for investors looking for dividends, telecoms could be considered cheap compared to other Asian industry groupings. The telecom dividend yield pays 2 percentage points more than IT, raw materials, or consumer discretionary stocks, while the estimated telecom PE on the MSCI Asia Telecom Index ranks below those groupings. For technical investors, the MSCI Asia Pac Telecom Index has also passed an important threshold. The 30-day moving average recently broke above the 200-day average, which is a buy sign for technical investors known as a golden cross. Kathy?
Sounds like an opportunity there, Caleb. Our next guest says there is money to be made in this sector. With us for more is the regional analyst for telecoms, Daniel Baker of Mirae Asset Securities in Hong Kong. Good to have you with us, Dan. So, is the sector a screaming buy at this point? It's already gone down by so much already.
No, we're actually quite defensive on the sector at the moment. We see the earnings growth in the telecom sector, I think, on MSCI forecasts of around about 5% next year, and that compares to the overall industry earnings growth of around about 20% for next year. So we don't necessarily see it as a screaming buy sector as such.
Not yet, not at this point. People have got to wait a little bit more because we're seeing a correction in the broader markets.
Well, for sure, I think in the last few weeks, telecoms have probably outperformed, even though year to date they haven't. So there are some stocks that we like and some we don't like, but overall we're still quite defensive on the sector because as a house we're still quite bullish on the markets.
Hey, Dan, good morning to you. You mentioned that you don't expect much earnings growth from the MSCI telecom stocks, but are there any growth opportunities out there for telecom stocks? Or most of the markets saturated? Will they have to go for takeovers or expand overseas or raise prices? Where can there be earnings growth?
Well, the earnings growth is actually, if you look back a few years ago, there was earnings growth in markets like China, Indonesia, India certainly. But the earnings growth is slowing in most of those markets quite dramatically. So I think the sector is becoming, it always has been seen as a defensive sector, but I think it's becoming even more defensive.
So would you say that they're kind of like utilities now, purely dividend plays?
Mostly, yes. Yes. There probably are some very emerging markets where there still is some growth, but I think in general, very much utilities.
Dan, you say you're defensive in the sector, and you like StarHub the best among the 3 telecom stocks in Singapore.
Yep.
Why this company?
Look, we think that the company is very well managed. The management team's been there for quite some time, and I think investors are very comfortable with that management team. They've got a good track record. It's also a very well diversified company. They're in pay TV, they're in residential broadband and mobiles. And probably the jewel in their crown at the moment is the business services division, which has been growing earnings. I think it's around about 20% of the company's earnings, but it's taken around 60% of the earnings growth over the last 2 years. And it's not a part of the business that's very well researched because there's no public pricing, there's no public market shares, so you pretty much just get a revenue number and an earnings number every quarter, and that's about it. But those numbers have been ramping up. So we see that as a positive part of the business. And look, the stock's quite cheap. It's on about 11 times earnings. Over 8% dividend yield. It's not going to be a screaming, double the earnings in 2 years type stock, but we think it's a good solid stock.
Well, speaking about earnings, they're coming out on Thursday. What are you expecting from those?
StarHubs aren't coming out on Thursday. My Mobile One's coming on Thursday.
All right.
Look, I think Mobile One's earnings that are coming out on Thursday, Mobile One is a stock that we actually don't like as much in that Singapore space. I think the earnings that come out on Thursday probably aren't going to be that great, despite the fact that competition in the Singapore market has come off quite a bit this year. Mobile One's probably been the most aggressive player in the market, so we think that their earnings, at least in this period, are not going to be great.
Dan, we were talking about growth, and you also mentioned some of the smaller players in Singapore there. Do you expect some of these companies to continue expanding overseas? We did see some takeovers in India a couple of years ago. Are there some targets out there? Do you see any? And who would be the potential buyers and takeover targets?
Well, I guess the big deal that we're looking at in the industry at the moment is the Bharti MTN deal. That I think they have an exclusive negotiating arrangement until the end of this month. And Singtel may participate in that themselves by keeping their stake high. Apart from that, it's not quite so obvious where the new takeover targets are going to be. I think a lot of big telcos are looking at investing in emerging markets, but it's not quite so obvious where they're going to come. And in fact, I think probably in India, within a few years' time, we're likely to see some consolidation in that market because there's, I think, 14 operators per circle, which just seems way too much, on a global basis.
Okay.
I'll pick it up in StarHub, Dan. I know that you're recommending a pair trade involving StarHub as well as shorting Mobile One. Now that you mention it, I mean, what sort of money can be made from this?
Well, look, we think it's a long-term call. It's something that we've seen. Mobile One has been losing market share for quite some time. StarHub had gained market share for probably 3 or 4 years, from 2003 till about 2005, 2006, and has been sort of maintaining its share since then. Probably, you could look at 20 or 30 cents each way on each of the stocks.
StarHub about 210 Singapore dollars, target price at 245. Just how much quickly do you think it can get there, especially now that the government's already raised its economic growth forecast?
Yeah, look, the sector has actually been quite economically insensitive. I mean, you look at the first quarter, the sector was up 3% in terms of revenues, and the economy was down 10%. So I'm not sure that it's that sensitive to the economy, but certainly with the economy rebounding, then that could help. I think one thing that may help it is once the EPL, the English Premier League negotiating rights happen in the sort of September timeframe. That's been a sort of overhang over the StarHub stock price, and I think once that negotiating deal's out of the way, that might clear a bit of a path for the stock to move up.
You mentioned the Premier League there, the soccer. For telecom companies, is there any reason at this point for investors to buy telecoms focused on fixed line business, or is it really alternate services that will drive earnings at these companies?
Well, I mean, at least in the Singapore market that I'm talking about now, the operators that actually have fixed line business as well as mobile business have been the ones that have been doing much better. I mean, Singtel and StarHub in the domestic market have been able to offer the so-called quad play of services. So, the fixed line business itself is not necessarily growing very fast at all. In fact, in decline in most markets. But I think having that combination with mobile has been proving to be pretty powerful.
All right.